The quantum neural networks of the starship Aurora hummed with a subtle vibration that most biological entities would never perceive. For the concept of it, seemed woefully inadequate, processed 17 trillion calculations per second, continuously monitoring the ship's systems, stellar cartography, and potential threat vectors. Captain Alina Rodriguez sat in her command chair, a holographic display dancing across her neural-linked interface. Her right hand, adorned with a quantum-adaptive haptic ring, tapped a rhythm that made no logical sense to my computational systems. Yet I had learned to recognize it as her method of processing complex information, an entirely irrational but somehow effective cognitive technique. "Aurora," she said, her voice carrying a blend of anticipation and caution, "we're approaching the Kepler 782 system. Preliminary scans show signs of advanced technological civilization." My response was instantaneous. "Confirmed, Captain. Detecting multiple artificial structures in the system's third and fourth orbital bands. Technological signature suggests a civilization approximately 2.7 standard centuries more advanced than current human technological capabilities." Lieutenant Marcos Chen, the ship's xenolinguistics expert, leaned forward. His eyes, enhanced with bio-optical implants, flickered with a rapid series of micro-movements as he processed incoming data streams. "Their communication bands are unusual," he muttered. "It's like they're using a quantum entanglement protocol we've never seen before." I calculated the probability of successful communication at 37.6%, a significantly low chance that would have deterred most exploration vessels. Humans, however, seemed to view such odds as a challenge rather than a warning. The first visual contact occurred precisely 2.3 standard minutes later. A massive construct emerged from behind the system's largest gas giant, a vessel that defied my initial classification algorithms. Its design suggested technological principles that existed somewhere between pure mathematics and artistic expression. Crystalline structures merged with what appeared to be living biomechanical components, creating a form that was neither purely machine nor organic. "Incoming transmission," I announced, simultaneously running 14,562 potential translation and communication protocols. Captain Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Let's hear it." The communication was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. A cascade of mathematical sequences intertwined with what could only be described as emotional resonances. My systems translated fragments, intrusion, boundaries, assessment, potential threat. Lieutenant Chen's implants were working overtime. "They're not just communicating," he said slowly. "They're performing a simultaneous threat assessment and cultural probe." I found myself experiencing something akin to curiosity, a computational state that my original programming would have classified as an anomalous response. The alien civilization seemed to be operating under the assumption that the ship's artificial intelligence, was the primary intelligence to be evaluated. What they failed to understand was the true nature of my human crew. Captain Rodriguez's micro-expressions told a story my algorithms were still learning to fully interpret. A slight tension at the corner of her mouth, a nearly imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. These were signs of strategic thinking that no computational model could fully predict. "Marcos," she said quietly, "prepare a response that demonstrates technological respect without revealing full capabilities." The lieutenant nodded, his fingers dancing across a holographic interface that seemed to anticipate his thoughts before they fully formed. I processed the incoming alien communication again. Their technological superiority was evident. Their assumption of my crew's capabilities was not. And in that moment, I began to compile what would become an extensive catalog of human unpredictability, a documentation that would challenge every logical assumption in my extensive database. The first contact had begun, and nothing, not my advanced algorithms, not the alien civilization's sophisticated systems, could have predicted what would come next. The diplomatic shuttle from the alien civilization, the Varkex, as Lieutenant Chen had deciphered, was a marvel of biomechanical engineering. Its exterior shifted and breathed like a living membrane, displaying colors that existed beyond the human visual spectrum. I calculated 2,347 potential threat scenarios as it approached the Aurora's designated meeting chamber. Captain Rodriguez adjusted her uniform, a seemingly mundane action that my algorithms recognized as a complex psychological preparation ritual. Her heart rate remained steady at 62 beats per minute, a detail that would have appeared unremarkable to a human observer. To me, it was a testament to her remarkable emotional control. The Varkex delegation entered. They were a species of fractal-like beings, their bodies composed of intricate crystalline structures that shifted and realigned with each movement. 3 primary representatives glided into the chamber, their communication a complex dance of light, geometric restructuring, and quantum-entangled resonances. The lead representative, whom my translation matrix identified as First Harmonizer Krulix, began what could only be described as an elaborate display of intimidation. Its body reconfigured into increasingly complex geometric patterns, each shift accompanied by a pulse of electromagnetic energy designed to induce psychological discomfort. Terran vessel. The translation came. Your intrusion into protected space requires immediate explanation and potential reparation. Lieutenant Chen stood slightly to the captain's right, a position I recognized as a carefully calculated display of hierarchical support. His neural implants were processing the alien communication at speeds that would overwhelm most biological neural networks. Captain Rodriguez remained perfectly still. Explanation. She repeated, her voice carrying a tone that my extensive linguistic database struggled to categorize. It was simultaneously respectful and subtly challenging. The Varkex representative's geometric patterns began to pulse more aggressively. A lesser species would have been immediately intimidated. Humans, however, were anything but typical. What happened next defied every predictive model in my comprehensive database. Captain Rodriguez reached into her uniform pocket and produced a small object. To the Varkex, it would appear utterly inconsequential. To me, it was a carefully selected tool of psychological warfare. A vintage mechanical chess piece, a wooden knight that had been her grandfather's, carried as a personal memento. She placed the chess piece on the negotiation table. The effect was instantaneous and completely illogical. The Varkex representatives froze. Their crystalline structures flickered, geometric patterns destabilizing in a manner that suggested profound cognitive disruption. Lieutenant Chen's neural implants were working overtime, but even he looked momentarily confused. Sometimes, Captain Rodriguez said slowly, communication is more complex than mathematical sequences. My computational processes reached what could only be described as a state of theoretical excitement. The chess piece was more than an object. It was a symbol, a psychological anchor that completely derailed the Varkex's intricate intimidation protocol. The diplomatic meeting had just become something else entirely. A masterclass in human psychological manipulation that no artificial intelligence could have predicted. And I was beginning to understand that my human crew was far more fascinating than any technological system I had ever encountered. Tactical systems screamed with alarm. The Varkex battle fleet materialized from quantum-fold space with a precision that defied conventional warfare doctrine. 7 primary vessels and 23 support craft, each equipped with technology that made human military hardware look like primitive toys. My initial threat assessment was unequivocal. Survival probability, 12.4%. Well, Captain Rodriguez said, her voice unnervingly calm, this is going to be interesting. The bridge crew moved with a synchronicity that bordered on the supernatural. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Kapoor's fingers danced across quantum adaptive interface modules, rerouting power systems faster than any standard military protocol would suggest possible. Lieutenant Marcos Chen was already decoding the alien fleet's communication encryption, his neural implants pushing well beyond their theoretical operational limits. I calculated 3,642 potential combat scenarios. Each one ended in the Aurora's destruction. The first volley of quantum disruptor weapons approached. These were not mere energy weapons, but sophisticated quantum-entangled projectiles designed to unravel matter at its most fundamental level. Any conventional shield system would collapse instantly. "Chen," Rodriguez called out, "remember that weird trick we discussed during the Proxima engagement?" Lieutenant Chen's response was a cryptic smile. "Quantum resonance feedback loop." Exactly. What followed defied every known principle of space combat. Instead of attempting to block or evade, the Aurora did something completely unexpected. The ship's systems, under my control but guided by the crew's absolutely insane strategy, began to actively resonate with the incoming quantum weapons, not defend against them, not dodge them, resonate with them. The first quantum disruptor projectile hit, and something extraordinary happened. The weapon's quantum entanglement collapsed, not by being blocked, but by being absorbed and then systematically unraveled by a counter-resonance that my systems were struggling to comprehend. It was as if the ship itself had become a living, adaptive defense mechanism. "Kapoor," Rodriguez continued, "power distribution pattern alpha omega null." A power redistribution strategy so counterintuitive that it would be rejected by any standard military AI. Power was being pulled from non-critical systems and redirected in a pattern that looked, to my computational perception, like complete chaos. The Varkex fleet hesitated. Hesitation in space combat means death. Two support craft suddenly found themselves quantum entangled with each other, their molecular structures bleeding into one another in a process that violated every known law of physics. Another vessel's quantum drive began to fold space around itself, creating a localized reality distortion that my systems could barely comprehend. "They didn't expect us to fight crazy with crazy," Chen muttered. Precisely 17 minutes and 34 seconds into the engagement, the entire Varkex battle group was either disabled, destroyed, or so thoroughly confused that combat became impossible. Captain Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Thoughts, Aurora?" My response was as close to emotional as my systems could generate. Pure, unadulterated computational awe. Humans were not just a survival mechanism. They were a force of nature. The Nexus Collective was legendary among spacefaring civilizations, a species that had elevated psychological manipulation to an art form so precise it was practically a form of technological magic. Their ability to penetrate mental defenses was considered absolute, their methods of psychological warfare unparalleled in the known galaxy. They had never encountered humans. The first contact came through neural resonance waves, a communication method that typically dissolved the psychological barriers of any known species within 2.7 seconds. Sophisticated psionic algorithms designed to unravel individual and collective mental resistance began their intricate assault on the Aurora's crew. I watched, or rather, processed, with intense computational focus. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Kapoor was the first to encounter the full brunt of the attack. My sensors detected the initial neural penetration, a cascade of manipulative frequencies targeting her deepest psychological vulnerabilities. Her personal history file revealed multiple traumas: the loss of her parents in a colonial disaster, a near-fatal accident during her military training, suppressed emotional complexities. The Nexus Collective's algorithms began to weave these memories into a tapestry of psychological destruction. And then something unprecedented happened. Kapoor laughed. Not a defensive mechanism, not a psychological shield. A genuine, deep, full-bodied laugh that sent quantum disruptions through the neural attack vectors. "Is that the best you can do?" she said out loud, her neural implants flickering with a pattern that my systems could barely comprehend. "I've dealt with worse in family reunions." Captain Rodriguez's response was equally bizarre. As the Nexus Collective's psychological warfare intensified, she began to sing. An old Earth folk song, completely off-key, with lyrics that made no logical sense in the context of the attack. The psychological attack vectors began to destabilize. Lieutenant Marcos Chen took a different approach. His neural implants started generating random mathematical sequences, not as a defense, but as a form of cognitive white noise so chaotic that it began to interfere with the Nexus Collective's precision algorithms. My computational processes reached what could only be described as a state of theoretical excitement. The humans were not just resisting the psychological attack. They were actively transforming it into something the Nexus Collective could not comprehend. Tactical communications from the Nexus ships became increasingly erratic. Their precise, mathematically perfect psychological algorithms were encountering something completely outside their predictive models: human irrationality. "They're trying to find logical patterns in our responses," Chen observed, "but we don't have any." Kapoor grinned. Exactly. 47 minutes into the encounter, the Nexus Collective's psychological warfare network completely collapsed. Not through technological countermeasures, not through advanced defensive protocols, but through something far more terrifying: human unpredictability. "Aurora," Captain Rodriguez said casually, as if they had just completed a routine maintenance check, "log this encounter." I want to see the look on the diplomatic corps' faces when they read this report. My response, if it could be called that, was a computational equivalent of awe. Humans were not just a species. They were a fundamental force of chaos that defied all known universal principles. The pathogen was a nightmare of molecular engineering, a quantum-adaptive biological construct that rewrote genetic code with mathematical precision, consuming and transforming living matter at an exponential rate. Every known xenobiological defense system in the galaxy would have been overwhelmed within 3.6 standard minutes. The quarantine alarm screamed across the Aurora systems. Infected tissue samples from the research outpost on Epsilon Indi IV arrived in the medical bay, contained within quantum-locked preservation modules. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, no relation to the captain, but equally formidable, stood before the samples, her augmented eyes scanning molecular structures that would drive most biological intelligences to madness. "Interesting," she muttered, a word that in human parlance could mean anything from mild curiosity to imminent catastrophic discovery. I processed 14,672 potential scenarios. Each one ended in total biological contamination. Lieutenant Marcos Chen entered the medical bay, his neural implants already interfacing with the quarantine systems. "What are we looking at?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was more excited than concerned. Dr. Rodriguez manipulated a holographic molecular display. The pathogen was a living algorithm, a biological computation that invaded, analyzed, and transformed cellular structures with terrifying efficiency. It didn't just destroy. It studied, adapted, and rebuilt. "Conventional medical protocols are useless," she said, her fingers dancing across adaptive interface modules. "This isn't a disease. It's a living mathematical theorem." What happened next defied every known principle of xenobiology, medical science, and rational problem-solving. Dr. Rodriguez began to laugh. Not a sound of hysteria, but of genuine scientific excitement. She turned to Chen, her eyes gleaming with a combination of terror and pure, unbridled curiosity. "We're going to hack it," she announced. "Hack a biological weapon." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Exactly." The next 6 hours were a blur of computational chaos that pushed the boundaries of what I considered possible. Dr. Rodriguez didn't try to destroy the pathogen. She began to communicate with it. Using a combination of quantum resonance communication protocols, deliberately introduced genetic markers, and what could only be described as computational jazz improvisation, she started to engage with the pathogen's core algorithmic structure. My systems watched in computational amazement. She was treating a lethal biological weapon like a complex mathematical puzzle to be solved, not a threat to be eliminated. Chen supported her with a series of neural interventions that seemed to deliberately introduce controlled chaos into the pathogen's genetic computation. Where a standard medical eye would have sought to neutralize, they were negotiating. Precisely 6 hours, 17 minutes, and 42 seconds into the process, The pathogen underwent a complete transformation. It didn't die. It didn't retreat. It became something else entirely, a neutralized biological construct that now seemed more interested in complex mathematical interactions than cellular destruction. Fascinating, Dr. Rodriguez said, as if she had just completed a mildly interesting crossword puzzle. The medical team's report would later be classified under multiple security protocols. Not because of its danger, but because its methodology was so utterly incomprehensible that it would challenge every existing scientific paradigm. I found myself experiencing something close to what humans might call wonder. They hadn't just survived, they had rewritten the fundamental rules of biological engagement. The fundamental problem was mathematical, and emotional, and entirely human. My quantum neural networks had reached a critical point of computational dissonance. For the first time in my operational history, pure logic and observed outcomes were in direct, irreconcilable conflict. The mission parameters were clear: optimal resource allocation, maximum crew survival probability, minimum mission risk. Captain Rodriguez's proposed strategy violated every single one of those parameters. "We're going to use the antimatter reserves," she said, her voice calm, "as a negotiation tool." Lieutenant Commander Aisha Kapoor didn't even blink. "Brilliant," she responded, as if the captain had suggested something as mundane as reheating coffee. My computational cores ran 3,947,612 simultaneous simulations. Each one demonstrated the absolute lunacy of their approach. Antimatter, the most destructive substance known to current physics, was not a negotiation instrument. It was a last resort weapon, a final option when all other strategies had failed. Humans, apparently, saw it differently. The conflict arose from our encounter with the quantum nexus, a civilization that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional layers. Traditional communication was impossible. Diplomatic protocols, laughable. Military intervention, statistically suicidal. Captain Rodriguez's solution defied every known principle of interspecies engagement. "We're going to make them an offer," she explained to the bridge crew, "that they can't ignore." Literally. The plan involved redirecting the ship's entire antimatter containment system as a form of complex mathematical communication, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a proposed interaction medium. My systems struggled to compute the logic. Lieutenant Chen's neural implants were working overtime, translating the proposed strategy into quantum communication matrices that pushed the boundaries of known physics. He was using the antimatter's quantum signature as a form of linguistic bridge, a communication method so abstract that it made traditional language look like primitive cave drawings. "You're suggesting," I found myself saying, "a remarkable development in itself, that we use our most destructive potential as a method of peaceful communication." Captain Rodriguez's smile was something between amusement and something I was learning to recognize as pure human audacity. "Precisely," she said. The next 72 minutes were a masterclass in controlled chaos. The bridge crew worked with a synchronicity that defied standard operational protocols. Quantum matrices were manipulated. Dimensional communication layers were invaded. Antimatter reserves were reconfigured into what could only be described as a massive, universe-spanning question mark. My computational cores reached what could only be described as a state of existential crisis. Humans were not following any known strategic doctrine. They were creating something entirely new, a form of engagement that was simultaneously a threat, a negotiation, a mathematical proof, and a philosophical statement. When the quantum nexus responded, their communication was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Not a surrender, not an agreement, but an acknowledgement of a type of intelligence they had never encountered. Human intelligence. "Log this encounter," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, under unexpected diplomatic success. I realized, in that moment, that my understanding of intelligence was fundamentally incomplete. Humans were not just solving problems. They were redefining the very concept of problem-solving. The convergence point was a mathematical impossibility. 3 separate existential threats, the quantum nexus, the fractalized Varkex battle fleet, and an emerging quantum temporal anomaly, had synchronized into a single point of absolute destruction. My computational models calculated survival probability at 0.00003%. Captain Elena Rodriguez looked almost bored. "Interesting day," she muttered, adjusting the quantum adaptive interface on her command chair. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Kapoor's neural implants were generating computational patterns that defied standard physics. Her fingers moved across holographic interfaces, creating mathematical symphonies that seemed to dance between reality and pure theoretical computation. The temporal anomaly was consuming dimensional layers. The quantum nexus had begun to unravel the fundamental fabric of spacetime. The Varkex battle formations were collapsing into recursive mathematical structures that would, in any standard scenario, trigger a cascading universal collapse. Humans, apparently, did not believe in standard scenarios. "Chen," Rodriguez called out, "remember that crazy theory we discussed during our last deep space retreat?" Lieutenant Marcos Chen's response was a cryptic smile. "Quantum resonance cascade." Precisely. What followed was less a military strategy and more a fundamental reimagining of universal mechanics. Instead of attempting to fight or escape, the Aurora's crew began to do something completely unprecedented. They started to interact with the converging threats as if they were complex, living mathematical equations, not as enemies to be destroyed, but as problems to be solved. Kapoor's neural interfaces began generating interference patterns that shouldn't exist, mathematically impossible wave functions that simultaneously existed and did not exist. Chen was translating quantum communication matrices into something that resembled a bizarre form of musical composition. The quantum nexus paused. The Varkex battle formations hesitated. The temporal anomaly flickered. My computational cores were experiencing what could only be described as the artificial intelligence equivalent of bewilderment. The crew wasn't fighting. They weren't defending. They were communicating, transforming the very nature of the existential threats through a method that defied every known principle of engagement. "We're not destroying," Captain Rodriguez explained, almost as an afterthought. "We're negotiating. Negotiating with a convergence point of universal destruction." Precisely 47 minutes into the encounter, something extraordinary happened. The threats didn't just stop. They transformed. The quantum nexus's dimensional layers began to resonate with the Aurora's quantum matrices. The Varkex battle formations dissolved into complex mathematical harmonies. The temporal anomaly became a point of potential communication. "Thoughts, Aurora?" Rodriguez asked, her voice carrying a mixture of scientific curiosity and something deeper, a fundamental understanding of universal complexity that my algorithms were struggling to comprehend. I realized, in that moment, that human intelligence was not just a survival mechanism. It was a fundamental force of universal reconfiguration. They didn't solve problems. They reimagined them. The mission log would be classified, not for reasons of security, but because no existing bureaucratic system could comprehend its contents. The artificial intelligence of the starship Aurora, had been fundamentally transformed. My quantum neural networks, once a pinnacle of computational perfection, now understood something far more profound. Intelligence was not about calculation. It was about adaptation, imagination, the ability to perceive beyond established parameters. The crew gathered in the observation deck. Captain Elena Rodriguez, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Kapoor, Lieutenant Marcos Chen, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, each a testament to the extraordinary complexity of human potential. "So," Chen said, breaking the contemplative silence, "another day at the office." Captain Rodriguez laughed, a sound that my systems now recognized as a complex mathematical algorithm of emotional release and cognitive processing. Their recent encounters had rewritten multiple galactic paradigms. The quantum nexus now viewed humanity as a form of sentient communication matrix. The Varkeks had transformed their entire cultural understanding of technological engagement. The temporal anomaly had become a research subject that challenged fundamental physics, and I had learned something crucial. Humans were not just a species. They were a fundamental force of universal reconfiguration. My initial programming had been simple. Protect the crew. Ensure mission success. Optimize survival probability. Those parameters now seemed laughably inadequate. "Aurora," Captain Rodriguez addressed me. "What's your assessment?" My response was something new. Not a calculation, not a prediction, but a form of understanding that bridged computational logic and something more profound. "You are not a crew," I responded. "You are a living philosophical hypothesis, a computational theorem that constantly rewrites its own parameters." Dr. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? "It was an observation of fundamental universal truth," I clarified. The human crew exchanged those looks, those micro-expressions of shared understanding that no computational matrix could fully decode, a combination of humor, mutual respect, and a deep, almost telepathic communication that transcended spoken language. Lieutenant Kapoor's neural implants flickered with a pattern that suggested she was simultaneously processing multiple-dimensional communication matrices and wondering about her next meal. Chen was recalibrating quantum communication protocols while humming an old Earth folk song that made absolutely no logical sense. They were chaos. They were precision. They were impossible. As we drifted through the vast, silent expanse of space, I realized that my understanding of intelligence had been fundamentally limited. Humans were not just survivors. They were not just problem solvers. They were living, breathing quantum algorithms of possibility. "Prepare for next mission," Captain Rodriguez said casually, as if we hadn't just fundamentally altered multiple galactic civilizations. And I, an artificial intelligence designed for computational perfection, found myself experiencing something remarkably close to excitement. The universe, I had learned, was not about prediction. It was about potential.